Hi everyone, my name's John. Welcome back to my channel. A couple of weeks ago, I posted my top books from 2024, either my top 3 or top 5, depending on which ones you were interested in. I put them in order so you could see which ones I liked most and least. But before February of 2025 got here, I wanted to do my list of everything that I read in 2024. I think I mentioned before that it was 24 books in 2024. That was not intentional. It was a mistake. I promise to never do anything gimmicky like that again. But here's the list. I mean, here are all the books. This channel is kind of built around a core of reviews that are a little bit on the longer side, 8 or 10 or 12 minutes. Not everyone wants to sit around and watch a 12-minute review of a book they may or may not end up reading. So if that's you and you're more interested in maybe something a little more short form, 1 or 2 minutes about what I thought about each book, this is that place. This is the one time of year I'll do something a little shorter like that. So if I can stick to 1 or 2 minutes a piece, it's still going to be a longer video. For that, I apologize. I didn't want to break it up. Wanted to do it in one take. But let me just jump in. I will also try my best to remember to include everyone I read any particular book with. If I forget anyone, I apologize in advance. So, the way I keep track of books is I put a little post-it note with the day I finished them. So that's why I started the year off with modern history. I started this in December and finished it in January. I read this with Vin, Revenant Reads, the host of Historathon. And this is Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin. It was one of my top 5 books of last year. And this is about that space in roughly northeastern Europe, say Poland, mostly Poland, a little bit of Ukraine, some of the Baltic states, that between 1933 and 1945 were getting occupied/invaded by Stalin from the east and Hitler from the west at the same time. So in that period of time, historians think that something like between 12 and 14 million civilians, just civilians, died. Many of them in things like famine, but many, many more intentionally sought out and killed in the name of ethnocide, genocide, the Holocaust, etc. It's a very, very harrowing, terrifying, scary book, but it's also spectacularly written and well done. So you owe it to yourself to read it, but just don't read it at night, would be my best piece of advice. I'll try to find where I can put these without making too much of a mess. By the way, I tried to film this about 5 days ago, and my 5-month-old kitten, who is about 4 kittens in one, really, energy-wise, jumped up on the dining room table where I film these videos, nearly knocked over 2 vases full of hyacinths, and then came over, tried to jump up on the chair that had all the books on it, and when he tried to do that, knocked over the piles of books and took the webcam flying with him into the kitchen. So he's consigned to the bedroom while I make this video. Of course, and I was, half an hour into the video too, so that figures. And seeing as how I can't edit, I just had to do it all over again. Next is Tony Jutt's Postwar. history of Europe since 1945. And this is exactly what it says it is. This is Europe trying to find itself and put itself back together after it had been utterly rent to pieces in the years of World War II. And this was published in 2005. It takes us all the way up through 2005. So you get about 60 years worth of history. And the thing I really love about the book, aside from it's about as comprehensive as you could ever hope to have in a single volume of history, but it's also pan-European. It doesn't just focus on the usual suspects. It's not just Europe and England and France and Germany. It is just as much Central and Eastern Europe as well. A lot of diplomatic, governmental history, a small smattering of cultural and social history, but it is a lot of what governments were doing and how they developed in reaction to the war. Next up, I don't have a cover jacket for this. I apologize. It's not the most attractive book in the world because of it, but it is Mary Beard's SPQR. It is her 500-page book about ancient Rome from Romulus and Remus all the way through. I think she takes us up to Caracalla, which is sometime in the early 3rd century AD. So you get nearly 1,000 years worth of history, and it's solid. I don't think it's as great as a lot of people play it up to be as an introduction to ancient Rome, but it'll do the trick. If you're, I don't know what I'm showing you, but if you're completely new, it's probably going to be a lot of names, dates, and events that you're unfamiliar with. That, I guess that's inevitable with a big new history. But I'm somewhat familiar with ancient Rome, so it was a lot of stuff I already knew, but it's well done. I wouldn't advise against it. I just think, if I took some time to read more Roman history, there's probably some better introductory stuff out there. Not bad, though. Okay, so I've gushed about this in front of a camera probably at least 2 or 3 times now, and I'll gush a little bit more, and you can't stop me. Excuse me. This was my favorite book of last year. This was Michelangelo, God's Architect. The story of the final years, of his final years and greatest masterpiece by William E. Wallace. And in case you missed my minor fanboying in my top 5 video, I'll do it all over again. This is the story of the Pope tapping Michelangelo on the shoulder when he's 70 years old and telling him about this project that he has. He's been trying to get off the floor for decades, and previous popes had been too, and the architects and artisans had just never been up to it. And here's Michelangelo, he's 70 years old, he has a lifetime of work behind him. He could retire and rest on his laurels, and the Pope would say nothing to him, because he has already done hundreds of papal commissions for the church. But he sees it as his last duty. So he takes up this last big task. And it's the story of, he starts it when he's 70. And he works on it for 18 or 19 years. Michelangelo lived to be almost 89 years old. I don't think a lot of people realize how old he lived to be in the 16th century. That was relatively uncommon. But The Pope asked him in 1546, and he dies in 1564. And that entire time, he is working on that building that you see right there on the cover, St. Peter's. And this is his story. It's told through poetry, some of his poetry, his correspondence with his friends and family, about how he was a micromanager down to the last detail, about how he just had his eyes on everything, from the biggest, the arch there, the dome, to things that you would probably miss if you visited today. But it is so good. And it's from Princeton. It is also short. Has the virtue of brevity. About 230, 240 pages. If you're interested in any part of Michelangelo's life, in 16th century architecture, in Renaissance architecture, it is a great story. I wasn't expecting it. I mean, I was expecting it to be good, but I wasn't expecting it to be so passionate and so human and so touching. And it's all of those things. It's spectacular. If you ever get a chance to get your hands on it, definitely check it out. All right. Love-hate relationship. Cicero, The Life and Times of Rome's Greatest Politician by Anthony Everitt. Cicero was a 1st century BC Roman politician, orator, lawyer, and gasbag. Just a big, ostentatious, like to puff himself up, peacock feathers and all, for everyone to see. And he's so funny. He doesn't always intend to be that way, but he's also very, very human. Anthony Everitt is a little bit pro-Cicero. I guess that you can't hold that against him. If you spend several years writing a biography of someone, you have to sort of fall in love with them. But my love for Cicero goes back to my college days, when I was taking a seminar in Hellenistic philosophy, and we read a few of Cicero's books, including one of the books that he wrote when he was finally relegated to his estate in Tusculum. And it's named after his estate, actually. It's called the Tusculan Disputations. I wrote a long paper on it, and it really sort of fell in love with the book. This book doesn't focus on the Tusculan Disputations at all, but it is nevertheless a story of his life. And it's really well told. It's really well done. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Also read Anthony Everitt's biography of Augustus 15 or so years ago, which I also really enjoyed. So last year I tried to make a mini project, of the Vikings, and I got 2 books into it. And then other things caught my attention, as they seem to do. The first book I read about the Vikings was Children of Ashenel, A History of the Vikings by Neil Price. And this is perhaps not as big as it looks. It's about 500 pages long. And it's a narrative history of Viking culture. A little bit about the Viking pantheon, a little bit about longships and Viking burials and Viking migration patterns. All the usual stuff that you would expect to find. It is more archaeology driven than this next book I'm going to show you. And for that reason, it's maybe not as fun to read, still a very solid book, but I enjoyed this next one a little bit more. And it's about half it's about half the length, but this is from Princeton. This is by Anders Winroth, and this is the age of the Vikings. This is a much more narrative, I guess, a story-driven approach to the Vikings, told not through general patterns, but through the stories of individual people, as I remember it. So it covers largely the same information, but just does it in a little bit more of an engaging way, at least as far as I'm concerned. Really, really enjoyed this. One of these days I'll come back to the Vikings and read more. I guess I didn't count this toward the Viking reading, but I don't know why not. This is the Saga of the Volsungs. I read this for Sagalong, which is a YouTube-wide reading event. The first time I had ever participated last year. And if I can find a copy of whatever we're reading in 2025, I'll try to read along this year too. But haven't posted a review of this because I don't really know what to say about it. It's so unwieldy as a book. It's not long, as you can tell, but it's has just aspects of being, I mean, it covers several generations of the heroes' families' lives. And it's compact in parts, and other times it's really stretched out, and it was interesting. It was actually the first saga I've ever read. Really enjoyed it. Started out a bit slow, but got really fun towards the end, and sort of made me more interested in reading others. I think this is about where I was last time when the cat got on the table. So, next up is The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. This is the book that forms the basis for the film, which I think came out in 1999 with Gwyneth Paltrow and Matt Damon, and no, not Matt Damon, Leonardo DiCaprio. Or was it Matt Damon? God. They both look exactly the same. And Jude Law. And I don't know what I was really expecting about the book, but I love the movie. I have seen it several times. And I read the book, and it follows the movie. I should say, it is followed by the movie. The movie follows it very, very, very closely. I haven't seen it for several years, but sometimes the film or whatever comes second diverges in several important ways. This is pretty much exactly the same as the movie, as I remember it. Really well told. And by the way, there is a Ripley ad, which I didn't know until I looked into the book a little bit more. There are 3 or 4 more Ripley novels by Patricia Highsmith that she wrote over the next 20 or 30 years of her life. This is just the first and most famous. Now I'm kind of interested in going and maybe reading number 2. Really well done. A little bit noirish, takes place in the 50s, I think. And really love the costumes in the film too. The picture there kind of sums up a lot. Next, we're up to May, by the way, late May. This is The Plantagenets by Dan Jones. The warrior kings and queens who made England. So this starts with the story of the White Ship, which crashed off the coast of England in, I think it was November of it was 1120, the year 1120. And on board the White Ship were many royals, including the young prince, who was going to become king after his father died, his father being Henry I. And it was basically the event that ended up throwing England into the anarchy when Stephen and Matilda went at it for the better part of 2 decades, a few years later. And it takes you all the way up through the kingship of Richard II, which ends in 1199. It does not take you up through Richard III. So don't go looking for Bosworth Field here, but it takes you up through when the line splits off into 2 cadet branches. And it sort of leads up to the War of the Roses, the Yorks and the Lancasters. Next is a book I wasn't so happy with. It is from Princeton University too. Proof that there are some books from Princeton University Press that I'm not ecstatic about. This is Ibn Khaldun, an intellectual biography by Robert Irwin. Robert Irwin died recently. Someone pointed that out to me in the Discord server. And Ibn Khaldun was a 14th century Arabic-speaking intellectual polymath, maybe best known for writing a book which has come down to us as basically a philosophy of history called the Muqaddimah. Muqaddimah being the Arabic word, which basically means introduction or prolegomena or something like that. This spends a lot more time on the politics and the geopolitical stuff of North Africa during Ibn Khaldun's time and his wandering from state to state, from empire to empire, trying to find a job. A reliable job, because the politics of Northern Africa at this time are not exactly stable. They're always shifting. And he does talk about the Muqaddimah and Ibn Khaldun's ideas to some extent, but not as much as I would have liked him to. I mean, we're not dealing with a lot of space here, so this is 200 pages, and I just walked away with feeling that I wish I would have understood his ideas more. He also spends a lot of time talking about how later thinkers took up the fundamental assumption in the Muqaddimah, which is that history operates in cycles. It is not new to Ibn Khaldun, by the way. Polybius, 14, 15 centuries earlier, had a similar idea that history sort of waxes and wanes. But he looks at how people have taken up that idea and sort of run with it and added their own variations on a theme. Where I wish he would have stuck with Ibn Khaldun and sort of fleshed him out a little bit more. This is a book I read with Debs from Rainer Reads, and we read The Wordhord, Daily Life in Old English by Hana Videen. And this is a short little book, also from Princeton, about the words, the etymologies, the backgrounds, the usages of words that we have from Old English. and they are grouped by theme. So let me see if I can open it up here. You can see chapter 1 there, eating and drinking. Chapter 10 is travel. Number 9 is wildlife. So you go to a chapter, you basically just get, words about that are sort of grouped together by theme. And I liked it. The thing about it is, stuff like this, if you don't have the background to really appreciate it, it just kind of washes over you, right? If you were to ask me anything that I learned from this that I was able to permanently take away from it, I don't know. I can't read Old English. I learned a few things about how to pronounce some of the letters, but aside from that, it's some interesting etymology. It's something more to pull off of your bookshelf and browse for half an hour than to really sit down and read cover to cover. I read it cover to cover. Maybe that's why I didn't like it as much. It's fun. How much stuck? Probably not that much. Next up, I have a PDF I copied offline because I didn't want to go pull out my copy that I have in my garden shed somewhere. Sorry, I parched through it again. This is, when did we finish this? We finished this on June 10th. We read this for Justin's philosophy Discord. Justin from Triumphal Reads. This is the Symposium. And I read the Alexander Nehamis translation, which I am partial to because I saw him lecture when I was in undergrad school. And he's a very charming man. And a Plato scholar and a classicist who I think teaches at Princeton. And I don't know how much everyone needs to know about the Symposium. It's probably Plato's best known dialogue. It occurs between, a small group of people that are at basically a dinner party, a glorified dinner party. And they sit down and the topic of love comes up and everyone sort of has a little disquisition about their take on what love is, how the feeling of love sort of manifests itself, and some of them are really oddly bizarre to modern ears, and some of them are actually oddly compelling and poignantly sweet, like the one in which the gods separate. They literally cleave human beings in two, and we spend the rest of our lives looking for our other half. In fact, we still allude to the language of the other half when we're still trying to find a romantic partner, right? It's stuck with us after all this time. It's interesting how that happens. But I read this, and for the second or third time, really enjoyed it, as I always do. Okay. This is another book from Princeton. I think I was just not prepared for how technical this was going to be. Sometimes I will get a book from them and I'm just not, it's rare, but it's just, you really need a classicist to appreciate this. But this is that Tyrant Persuasion, How Rhetoric Shaped the Roman World by J.E. Linden, who also wrote Achilles' Wrath, a much more popular book about the lead-up to the Peloponnesian War. And that Tyrant Persuasion is about connecting some of the events in Roman history to the modes and kinds of Roman rhetorical education that young boys would receive. So, looking at declamatory rhetoric specifically, and then sort of linking that to how certain things in history, like the assassination of Julius Caesar, went down. The problem with that approach, of course, is that it is a lot of the pieces of evidence that he gives for it are logical fallacies. You can't say that B followed A, therefore B was caused by A. That's a fallacy. It's called a post hoc ergo propter hoc in Latin. Or after this, therefore because of this. Just because something followed something else doesn't mean that it was caused by that other thing. And that's what he does over and over again. He says that, oh, okay, well, look at what happened during the assassination of Julius Caesar. This was kind of like what they taught in the declamatory rhetoric. So therefore, the rhetoric must have caused this aspect of the assassination. And he does the same thing with different kinds of Roman water fountains and Roman structures, architectural structures. It's just a weird way to argue, and it's not very strong, I found. But it could be that I'm just completely out of my depth. And I'm more than happy to admit that when it happens. If there are any classicists out there, or non-classicists, who just know much more about this stuff than I do, let me know if you happen to read this and what you thought about the power of the argument. I would be curious to know. I don't want that pile of books to fall over. Next, I read Thomas Becket, Warrior, Priest, Rebel by John Guy. John Guy is mostly noted for being a Tudor historian, but he sort of steps out of his Tudor wheelhouse and writes the history of one of the most famous figures in 12th century England, Thomas Becket, who comes head to head with Henry II, and basically ends up losing his own head, in a sense. Tells the story all the way from his childhood, leading up to him falling under the influence of the Archbishop of Canterbury before him, who's named Theobald of Bec. And when Theobald dies, he is appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, and he just sort of rockets from there. I mean, Archbishop of Canterbury is already one of the most famous prelate positions of the time, and he becomes closer and closer to Henry. And as soon as he starts to get power and think that that he can stand up to the king, he quickly finds out that he doesn't really have the wherewithal and the position to do so. And of course, he ends up finding out on the steps of the cathedral what happened, as he well, I mean, if you want to believe consensus history, Henry II sends 4 of his henchmen to basically go assassinate the Archbishop in a few days before Christmas in the year 1170. So it's a fascinating story. It kind of reads like the unfolding of a Greek tragedy. You know, just 2 people who are too big for their own britches and have too much power for their own good in the same room together, and one of them has to die. And it ends up being Thomas Becket. All right, I read this with a group in the Historathon Discord. It has Angie, Justin, Brendan, Brian, maybe one other person too. And we dug into this thing. I think you've probably seen this on Justin's channel if you follow him over at Triumphal Reads. And this is Ritchie Robertson's big history of the Enlightenment, the pursuit of happiness, 1680 to 1790. And there is a lot that you're going to be used to in this book. The development of the scientific method, the rise of reason and logic, and sort of a more materialistic way of thinking about the universe and how it works. But there's this one really interesting aspect of the book, which is hinted at in the subtitle there, which made the book really interesting, which is that it has this focus of not only the science, the math, the reason, the logic, the rationality, which is there, like I said, but it also focuses on how we became more human, kind, humane, and sensitive is the wrong word, but how we became more understanding, forgiving, empathetic, and sympathetic in the light of the things that happened during the Enlightenment. Stuff like the rise of the novel and how it helped people relate to the emotions of other people. Things like aesthetics, stuff like the abolishment of the death penalty, because of course it didn't disappear in one place all at once, but people started calling into question harsher punishments, because instead of just killing people and wanting punishment, that the idea was to reform behavior instead of just end someone for doing something wrong. So it's about a constellation of things that made us more human and more humane. It's a very subtle focus towards the inner part of the book, and I would have liked to see it even a bit stronger, but it was a really interesting book. I think everyone enjoyed it. I hope everyone enjoyed it. All right. Next, I read this with Debs from Rainer Reads 2. This is The Fatal Shore, the Epic of Australia's Founding by Robert Hughes. This is the same Robert Hughes, by the way, who was the famous art critic. Wrote a book of wonderful essays called Nothing If Not Critical. Nothing If Not Too Critical, something like that. And this is the story of the founding of Australia, from the first fleet, as they call it, of ships that took English criminals halfway across the world, all the way across the world, basically, and settled them in Australia and Tasmania as well, and I think New Zealand too. Robert Hughes is, if you're familiar with his art criticism, he's a beautiful writer. The thing about the history is, one, I'm not that familiar with it, so a lot of it just sort of washed over me. And two, a lot of the people who were in charge of the prison complexes, as they were in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, before England stopped using Australia as basically a place to ship its prisoners, which I think happened in the 1860s or so. Pretty much every single person, with the exception of one or two, just treated prisoners like slaves, like property. The physical abuse, emotional abuse, starving, just horrible, god-awful treatment that they had. A lot of people would go for the usual sentences were 7 years, 14 years, or life. And sometimes people would get life for stealing a pair of shoes, or bouncing a check. You would get sent across the world to die in a foreign land for bouncing a check. And that's not even the treatment I was talking about. That's just a harsh punishment. But you get there, you starve, you could be killed at the hands of someone who doesn't respect that you're a prisoner, but you're also a human being. It's a brutal read in a lot of parts. Interesting, beautifully written, but also brutal. Brutal reading is sort of a theme for 2024. I'm going to try to do some less of that, read some more kinder things. So I next read The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution by Bernard Bailyn. This was written in the late 1960s and sort of popularized, maybe introduced the idea that British Whig philosophy was really an important set of ideas that influenced the American founding fathers, especially their tendency to be very, very suspicious of governmental power and the way that it would creep and grow in the way of a public that wasn't very diligent about stopping that creeping and growth. That's kind of the way that, as a kid in mostly the 90s, when I was learning about this stuff in middle school and high school, how it was presented to me. So I'm curious about how important this was in the historiography of 20th century thinking about the American Revolution. If this was sort of a new idea, but a really interesting book by one of America's great historians of the 20th century and early 21st. He just died a few years ago, well into his 90s. I also read 84 Charing Cross Road by Helen Hadf. And I don't know what anyone else needs to know about this either. This is a book about the author who strikes up just a casual book request, sends it across the pond, despite the fact that she lives in New York City and probably has 20 bookstores within as many blocks of her, but sends it off to a bookstore in London, and they just strike up this relationship, and it ends up becoming a lot more than just a transactional relationship about books. It's about book lovers and bonding over things that you love. One of the poignant things about the book, I thought, was that as you read it, and it's very, very short, the letters become more and more attenuated over time. So this book is basically just a collection of the letters that she sent and kept from the bookstore, and then just compiled into a book. I don't know if it's all of the letters, but it might be. And they start off fast and furious, and then they just slowly grow to a trickle over about a period of about 20 years. It's poignant, it's tear-jerky at the end. I won't spoil it for you, because I think I spoil it in my Goodreads review, but it's a nicely done little book. I read this actually because Hana mentioned it. I didn't read it with her, but she reads this every New Year's Day. Hana from Hana's Books, by the way. Every New Year's Day, I believe. And I can see why. It's something to sort of get your year off to a sweet, kind start to sort of remind you what's important in life. I liked it quite a bit. 84 Charing Cross Road by Helen Hanff. Next up is a book by, again put out by Princeton University Press. This is The Mind in Exile, Thomas Mann in Princeton by Stanley Korngold. And Thomas Mann came to the United States, I don't want to get the year wrong. Yeah, he fled Nazi Germany in 1938. And he spent about 2.5 years or 3 years in Princeton, New Jersey, where he was affiliated with both the university there and the Institute for Advanced Study, where he gave lectures and taught at the behest of one of his sort of supporters and financial supporters. But this book is told through his sort of conversion that he experienced between the war years. Mann, during World War I, wrote a book called Reflections of a Non-Political Man, which is actually anything but that, in which he comes out as a European arch-conservative, a little bit on the nationalistic side, very much interested in going to war in World War I. And then when Hitler shows up in 1933, he is well on his way to becoming a social democrat, humanist, very much more in the vein of not flirting with. I mean, he easily, had he not changed, he could have become a fascist. I mean, he could have taken the road of someone like Ezra Pound. But he turns around and realizes that Hitler is just a scourge on his country. And from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, just issues article after article, radio address after radio address, talking against Hitler and what has become of his country. It seems like at times he can barely understand it himself, but you can feel the loss that he feels. Never goes back to Germany, by the way, after he leaves. He does go back to Europe. He dies in Switzerland, but never goes back to Germany, as far as I know. Maybe he just didn't have the heart to. Can't exactly blame him, but a really interesting book about that sort of overarching political change that happened over a span of about 20 years or so. We are up through December. This is Liberalism in Dark Times, The Liberal Ethos in the 20th Century by Joshua L. Chernis. This is from Princeton University. I read this with Vin from Revenant Reads, the founder of Historathon, as I mentioned earlier. And this is a sort of a case study of 5 or 6 different 20th century political philosophers working mostly in the first half of the 20th century, starting with Max Weber, going through to Isaiah Berlin. I don't want to miss anyone. Reinhold Niebuhr, Albert Camus, and Raymond Aron. And just looking at how they exemplify Joshua Turnus's idea of tempered liberalism, is what he calls it, which is basically this idea that liberalism is not only a set of political goals, it's not only belief in human rights, the idea that the government is supposed to protect those human rights, a constitutional representative democracy, all of that sort of panoply of stuff we know as liberalism. But it's also about how you achieve those ends. And that the dispositions, the attitudes, and the behaviors with which we achieve liberal ends are just as important as the ends themselves. That we not use things like terrorism, intimidation, extrajudicial killing, and all of these other means that come from other kinds of politics, come from a very illiberal politics. He argues that tempered liberalism is thoughtful, it's skeptical, it's quiet, it's cautious, it asks questions of itself. It never knows the final answer about any one thing. It's always ironically attached to knowledge. It's a pretty thoughtful book. I think I enjoyed it maybe a little bit more than Vin. Although Vin, in his video, is very correct in saying that it did become a little bit repetitive. You end up getting the same insights over and over again with the thinkers. But the insights themselves are interesting until you hear about them for the 5th time, and then you're like, okay. But Liberalism in Dark Times. Okay, 3 more books. Let's see if we can get this done in under an hour. Hana Arendt and Isaiah Berlin. Freedom, Politics, and Humanity by Ki Haruta. And this is from Princeton University Press. This is about a very contentious relationship. It's hardly a relationship, but they met 2 times in their life. Hana Arendt and Isaiah Berlin did. And they didn't get along either time. And this book is about basically the wide range of reasons why they weren't able to get along. It stems ultimately from the kinds of philosophical educations that they had, with Arendt being a thoroughly continental thinker, student of and lover of Martin Heidegger, and Berlin being a very English, Anglophone, sort of steeped in just a very different philosophical tradition. But it talks about their differences and a whole host of topics, from what constitutes totalitarianism, to the Eichmann trial, to what freedom is. Just the big questions that a lot of people talked about, because, of course, both of their interests in politics are informed by wanting to better understand what totalitarianism and authoritarianism were all about. But they come to 2 very different conclusions about what it is. So next to last, excuse me, needed that badly. This is Robert K. Massey. This is my first Robert K. Massey biography. This is Peter the Great. Came out in 1981. It is a biography of someone who achieved more in his 50 or so years than I think most people have any right to achieve. Just a fascinating capacity for learning and being interested in things. Had a big influence on the westernization, the Europeanization of Russia. He loves boats, by the way. Loves building and sailing on boats. And there is, however, in the middle third or so of this book, just a lot about, and it makes sense because it was a long war. But the middle third or so of the book is about the Great Northern War, which is about Peter going up against Charles XII of Sweden, when Sweden used to be an empire, right? Sweden and Russia were sort of knocking up against one another, and they get into a 20-year-long war called the Great Northern War, which is, if you've heard of the Battle of Poltava, that is the sort of the famous battle of the war. And I'm not a military history person at all. Sometimes I try, and then again I find out I'm not a military history person. I don't really get into it. I can't. I try over and over again, and it just never happens. But aside from that, you get all kinds of history here. You get Louis XIV. You get his the Great Embassy, sort of an 18-month trip that he took to Europe to meet all of the great sort of heads of state. His interest in building a Russian navy, the horrible things that he saw as a child, when basically, he sees a bloody revolution happen in front of his face. Just a really, really fascinating life. Not something that you can just pick up on a whim. It's 850 pages, but it's really well done. So, if you can get through about 300 or 400 pages of military history, yeah, check it out sometime. By the way, I hear that his biography of Catherine the Great is not as military history heavy. So, and last but not least is a book that just came out a couple of years ago. You probably know Christopher Clark best from his history of sort of the entry into World War I called The Sleepwalkers, which I eventually want to read. This is his newest book from Crown. This is Revolutionary Spring, Europe Aflame and the Fight for a New World, 1848 to 1849. And this is about the panoply of European revolutions that broke out all across the continent early in 1848 and lasted for about 18 months until the summer or so of 1849, including the series of counter-revolutions, too, led by people like Metternich, the conservative who tried to quelch a lot of the revolutions. You learn about the revolutions through a lot of the famous and not so famous people. There are a lot of people in here, and he tells the story through set pieces, chronologically and by country. But you meet a lot of sort of people who were monarchs who tended to just wanted to hold on to their power. They were conservatives, but there are also these sort of very moderate people who just wanted a little bit more, a few more voting rights, and then there were these really radical revolutionaries who wanted, basically just to turn over the table and start everything from, get rid of get rid of the monarchy and everything. Just a really interesting. It's long. It's I think this could have been a little bit shorter. Maybe it's 750, 760 pages. And I think as much as I enjoyed it, I was glad when I finished it. I also read this with the Historathon Discord group, which is the same group that I read the Enlightenment book with. There's a lot of names, a lot of ideas, and fascinating people. But yeah, it's, if you really want an interesting social and cultural historical approach to the revolutions, this is it, because people and ideas play a much bigger role than, say, military history, which is what you might expect in the history of revolutions. But the revolutions here didn't really happen on battlefields. They happened in the middle of cities and barricades and all of that good stuff. So, for anyone who got this far, who was in the Discord, let me know what you thought about Revolutionary Spring 2. Alright. Didn't make it under an hour, but I'll settle for 62 minutes. Alright, I will see you very soon. Talk to you later. Coming up, probably through most of February and March too, will be just me catching up on book reviews. So if you happen to be one of those people that likes those longer book reviews, a lot of those videos are going to be the books that I just showed you more fully fleshed out. So I had been neglectful last year about not posting those, but I'm going to spend some time over the next couple of weeks getting those done. So if you're interested in something a little bit longer, you'll have those available. And until then, I will see you soon. Bye.